Dear listener, welcome to this calm and unhurried journey through history here on the Histovale channel. We sincerely hope you are finding full rest in this late hour of the night. Now, let us enter that quiet chapter of history.
In the late autumn of 1780, the waters of the Chesapeake Bay held a stillness that was both beautiful and terrifying. The American Revolution was nearing a fever pitch, but while the battles on land were fought with the roar of cannons and the clash of steel, a different kind of war was being waged in the salt-heavy shadows of the Virginia coastline. It was a war of whispers, of hidden ledgers, and of a specialized nautical logistics system known only to a handful of men. On a night when the moon was thin, a mere silver sliver reflected in the black glass of the bay, 3 merchant frigates sat low in the water near a secluded inlet. These were the ships of the Silent Convoy. Officially, they were the Marie Claire, the Ariel, and the St. Jude, listed in maritime records as carrying common supplies of French wool and salted flour. But beneath the floorboards of the captain's quarters, tucked into reinforced oak crates, lay the true cargo, nearly 4 tons of French gold and Spanish silver. The Desperate Dispatch. This was the Chesapeake Dispatch, a secret financial artery designed to keep the Continental Army from collapsing. General Washington's forces were exhausted, their currency nearly worthless. This gold was not just metal, it was the physical manifestation of hope, sent by the French crown to ensure the rebellion did not starve in the winter to come. The man entrusted with this drowned fortune was Captain Jonathan Blake, a mariner of few words and an uncanny ability to read the ocean like a living text. Blake understood that the greatest threat was not the British blockade, though the Royal Navy's frigates prowled the coast like hungry wolves, but a different kind of war was being waged in the salt-heavy shadows of the Virginia coastline. The geometry of invisibility. The Silent Convoy did not move with the wind. They moved with the thermal nulls, areas of the bay where the interaction between cold river water and the warm Atlantic current created permanent, localized fog banks. Blake had spent years mapping these blind spots, knowing that a ship draped in natural mist was more invisible than a ship hidden by the darkest night. On the night of the departure, the convoy moved with a ghostly precision. No bells were rung, no lanterns were lit. The sailors worked in a practiced rhythmic silence, their boots wrapped in oiled canvas to muffle their footsteps on the deck. They were not just sailing, they were participating in a grand act of strategic stealth. The gold was segmented across the 3 ships to ensure that even if one was captured, the revolution would not be entirely bankrupted. However, Blake carried the only master manifest, a small wax-sealed cylinder containing the Chesapeake Dispatch logs. This document linked the gold segments to a series of hidden subterranean vaults along the York River, vaults that would only be opened if the convoy arrived at a precise, pre-calculated moment. The weight of the secret. As the ships cleared the mouth of the inlet and headed toward the open, treacherous waters of the lower bay, the crew felt the weight of the secret. It was a physical presence in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the rigging. They were moving 4 tons of wealth through a landscape occupied by the greatest navy on Earth, governed by a code that even the officers did not fully understand. Captain Blake stood at the helm of the Marie Claire, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the wheel. He looked out at the dark horizon, where the line between sea and sky was lost in the gray Atlantic gloom. He knew that the lunar lexicon, the celestial key to his navigation, was entering its most critical phase. The tides were beginning to shift, and the ghost shoals of the Virginia coast were preparing to rise from the depths. The silent convoy had begun its journey. It was a journey away from the world of men and into the world of the elements, a path where the gold would eventually find a grave so deep and so silent that it would remain unrecorded for centuries. The Chesapeake dispatch had been sent, but as the first chill of a mountain wind hit the sails, the cipher of the Siren began to hum with the first notes of a coming watery disaster.
As the Marie Claire and her sister ships glided further into the dark throat of the Atlantic, Captain Jonathan Blake retreated to his cramped cabin. While the crew maintained their vigil in the salt spray and the gloom, Blake sat under the dim, swaying light of a single gimbaled oil lamp. Before him lay the heart of the mystery, a weathered, vellum-bound journal known among the high-ranking members of the Continental Secret Service as the Lunar Lexicon. This was not a book of words, but a book of light. It was a navigation system that relied on the subtle, mathematical relationship between the moon's phases and the shifting topography of the ocean floor. To the British Royal Navy, the coast of Virginia was a collection of static charts and soundings. To Blake, guided by the lexicon, it was a living, breathing clock of sand and water. The grammar of the moon. The lunar lexicon was based on a theory developed by a recluse astronomer in Philadelphia. It posited that the tides did not just rise and fall, they carved temporary underwater canyons through the shifting sandbars of the Chesapeake. By calculating the exact gravitational pull of the moon at specific degrees of the night sky, a navigator could predict when these ghost channels would open. The lexicon was divided into 3 sections. The waxing variable, instructions for navigating when the tides were aggressive, forcing the gold-laden ships into deeper, riskier currents to maintain speed. The syzygy alignment, a complex set of tables used only during the new moon when the lack of light required the navigator to sail by feel and the sound of the surf against the shoals. The refraction table, a guide to how the moonlight reflected off the various mineral deposits in the coastal waters, a primitive but effective way to detect the depth of the water by the color of its silver sheen. Blake's fingers traced the ink-stained tables. He was looking for the Siren's Gate, a specific point where the lunar gravity would pull the tide low enough to reveal a narrow, deep-water passage through the treacherous shoals near Cape Henry. The celestial Cipher. For the American revolutionaries, the moon was more than a light source. It was a celestial cipher. On this particular night, the moon was in its last quarter, a waning hook that cast long, distorted shadows over the waves. According to the lexicon, this was the only time the silent convoy could pass through the inner shoals without being detected by the silhouette hunters of the British fleet. The British ships sat further out in the deep water, their lookouts trained on the horizon for the white sails of merchantmen. But Blake was not on the horizon. Guided by the lunar lexicon, he was threading the convoy through the belly of the bay, waters so shallow and turbulent that no rational captain would dare bring a frigate through them.
The gold beneath his feet felt heavier tonight. It was as if the metal itself was reacting to the lunar pull, a dense weight that anchored the ships to the secret rhythms of the lexicon. Every degree the moon moved across the sky changed the depth of the water beneath the Marie Claire by inches. It was a game of architectural precision played out in a world of liquid and light. The sound of the stars. In the absolute silence of the convoy's blackout mode, the sailors began to experience what the lexicon called acoustic navigation. When the lunar pole reached its peak, the water moving over the sandbars produced a distinct, low-frequency hum. To the uninitiated, it sounded like the moaning of the wind. To Blake, it was a confirmation of his calculations. He adjusted the ship's heading by a mere 2 degrees. The Ariel and the St. Jude followed his wake, their movements synchronized by the rhythmic flashing of a shuttered lantern, a code that mirrored the twinkling of the stars. But as the moon began to slip behind a veil of high skeletal clouds, the lexicon's predictability began to waver. A sudden, unpredicted chill moved through the water, a cold surge that signaled a change in the tidal density. The lunar lexicon had warned of such anomalies, referring to them as the Siren's breath. It was a moment where the stars and the sea fell out of alignment, leaving the navigator blind in a landscape of shifting glass. Captain Blake closed the journal and stepped back onto the deck. The air was thick with the scent of wet sand and coming storms. The moon was gone, and the stars were fading. They were entering the Ghost Shoal, the place where the lexicon ended and the permanent silence of the sea began. As the moon retreated behind a thick shroud of clouds, Captain Blake's meticulously calculated journey entered its most treacherous phase. The lunar lexicon had taken the silent convoy through the labyrinthine channels of the Chesapeake, but it could not account for the whims of a geology in constant flux. Ahead lay the Ghost Shoal, a stretch of water near the Virginia coastline that appeared and vanished with the unpredictable pulse of the Atlantic. It was a place where traditional maps offered only deception and where the depths were constantly rewriting themselves. The anatomy of the vanishing sands. The Ghost Shoal was an anomaly. Unlike stable sandbars, this shoal was formed by a complex interaction of 3 forces: the tidal confluence, where the strong currents of the Atlantic met the outflow of the Chesapeake Bay, creating a chaotic churn of sediment; the submarine river delta, an ancient submerged river system that periodically released vast quantities of silt and sand; and the marine quicksand, pockets of highly unstable thixotropic sand that could shift from solid to liquid in response to seismic vibrations or even the rhythmic pounding of waves. To navigators, the Ghost Shoal was a legend, a place of shipwrecks and vanishing islands. It was a shallow, shifting landscape of underwater dunes and temporary channels, illuminated only by the faint bioluminescence of disturbed plankton. The Siren Cipher had pointed to a narrow, transient passage through this area, but warned of its inherent instability. Here the earth breathes, and the water forgets its depth. The illusion of passage. Blake ordered the convoy to slow to a crawl, their sails barely catching the faint, damp breeze. Lead lines were cast, their weighted ends hitting the bottom with unnerving speed, indicating depths that fluctuated wildly. One moment they were in 12 feet of water, the next a mere 8. The ships, heavy with their cargo of gold, drew nearly 10 feet. They were sailing on borrowed inches. The atmosphere was thick with a premonition of disaster. The usual rhythmic creaks of the ships were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the slosh of water against the hulls and the whispered commands of the officers. The fog, already dense, began to thicken further, clinging to the rigging like wet shrouds. The visual null, a complete loss of horizon, of fixed points, of any sense of direction, save for the deep internal compass of the seasoned sailor. Blake, at the helm of the Marie Claire, felt the ship shudder. It was not the impact of rock, but the unsettling sensation of sand shifting beneath the keel, a grating, whispered sound that spoke of geological unease. The ship was no longer truly floating. It was being held by the shoal, cradled by the shifting sands. The tidal trap. The lunar lexicon had predicted a brief window of stability, but it had not foreseen the sudden violent squall that descended upon the convoy. A gust of wind, sharp and cold, tore through the fog, followed by a torrent of rain that turned the entire world into a blinding, churning chaos. The squall did more than obscure vision. It fundamentally altered the hydrology of the Ghost Shoal. This sudden influx of wind and rain intensified the current, causing the unstable sands to liquefy at an accelerated rate. The carefully formed ghost channel began to collapse inward, trapping the ships in its soft, yielding grip. The Ariel, being the lightest of the three, was the first to ground. Her keel bit into the shifting sand, and she listed sharply. Then the St. Jude, caught in the chaotic churn, was spun violently, her rudder tearing away from its mounts. Blake watched in horror as the two ships, now helpless, began to sink deeper into the liquid sand, their masts tilting at impossible angles before vanishing into the opaque white of the storm. The Siren's Lament. The Marie Claire, heavier and more deeply laden with the bulk of the world, fought harder, but the quicksand of the shoal had now fully activated. It was like a living entity pulling at the hull, suctioning the ship down with an inexorable force. Blake could hear the groaning of the timbers, the straining of the deck planks as the ship twisted under the immense pressure. He knew then that the Siren's Cipher was not just a guide, but a lament. It had led them to a passage that was too fragile, too fleeting. The gold, meant to save a nation, was now destined to become a geological artifact, swallowed by the very depths it sought to navigate. As the Marie Claire began its final slow descent, the storm raged, erasing any trace of the convoy from the surface. The Ghost Shoal had done its work. It had absorbed the ships, the gold, and the secret, returning to its usual state of shifting, invisible menace. Beneath the churning waves, the drowned gold of the Revolution settled into its permanent watery grave, preparing to be encased in the silent embrace of the coral crypt.
In the decades and centuries following the disappearance of the silent convoy, the site of the disaster underwent a transformation that was as much biological as it was geological. The Marie Claire, the Ariel, and the St. Jude did not simply rot away on the seabed. They became the foundation for a massive underwater structure known to modern marine archaeologists as the Coral Crypt. The Virginia coastline, while generally too cold for tropical coral reefs,
contains specific pockets of warm water vents and mineral-rich currents. The wrecks of the gold ships happened to settle directly into one of these unique ecological zones, creating a submerged coffin that would preserve the gold more effectively than any bank vault. The calcification of history. When the ships first settled into the liquefying sands of the Ghost Shoal, the heavy oak hulls acted as a hard substrate in an otherwise shifting world of silt. Within years, a specialized species of cold-water stony coral began to colonize the wreckage. The process was relentless and systematic. The iron carbonate bond. The iron fittings of the ships, the cannons, the anchor chains, and the hull spikes began to oxidize. This oxidation process attracted calcium carbonate from the seawater, creating a rock-hard layer of concretion that fused the wood to the seabed. The living shield. Layers of coral grew over this concretion, forming a biological shell that was nearly 5 feet thick in some places. This shell acted as a barrier against oxygen and wood-boring shipworms, effectively mummifying the ships within a tomb of living stone. The silt seal. The shifting sands of the shoal continued to bury the lower halves of the ships, sealing the gold-filled crates in an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment. To the modern diver, the wreck site does not look like a collection of ships. It looks like a series of strange, jagged limestone ridges rising from the flat, sandy floor, a coral crypt that hides its treasures in plain sight. The golden core. Deep within this limestone sarcophagus, the French gold and Spanish silver remain in a state of eerie perfection. Unlike iron, which rusts, or wood, which decays, gold is chemically inert. It does not react with the salt or the stone. Inside the submerged coffin, the leather pouches that once held the coins have long since disintegrated, leaving the gold to settle into the gaps of the rotting oak floorboards. Over time, the pressure of the ocean and the growth of the coral have pressed the coins into the sediment, creating what archaeologists call a gold pavement. If one were to cut through the 5-foot-thick coral crust of the Marie Claire, they would find thousands of gold coins fused together by silt and pressure, forming a solid metallic layer at the base of the hull. This is the drowned gold of the Revolution, a literal foundation of wealth that helped birth a nation, yet never saw the light of day. The guardian of the wreath. The coral crypt is not just a tomb, it is an active ecosystem. The jagged edges of the coral and the iron cannons, now encased in stone, have created a labyrinthine habitat for deep-sea predators. Large tiger sharks and moray eels inhabit the hollow spaces where the captain's quarters once stood, providing a natural, if be unintentional, defense for the treasure. The site is also plagued by a phenomenon known as the sand pulse. Because the Ghost Shoal is still active, the wreck site is periodically covered and uncovered by massive underwater sand dunes. A survey crew might find the coral crypt on one expedition, only to return a month later and find nothing but one flat, empty expanse of white sand. The mountain of coral and gold simply vanishes back into the earth, governed by the same tides and lunar cycles described in the lunar lexicon. The anatomy of the crypt. The final poetic irony. The very documents Captain Blake carried, the secret manifests, and the Siren Cipher were stored in lead-lined cylinders. Modern sonar suggests that these cylinders are likely encased in a specific pocket of the coral growth where the pressure is at its highest. The gold is not just lost, it is absorbed. It has become part of the geological and biological record of the Atlantic. To recover it would require destroying one of the most unique coral structures in the Western Hemisphere, a price that modern environmental laws and the sheer difficulty of deep-sea excavation have so far refused to pay. The coral crypt remains the final, silent resting place of the Chesapeake Dispatch, a coffin of gold waiting in the permanent, pressured dark.
As the years drifted into decades, the physical memory of the silent convoy faded from the surface, but its ghost continued to haunt the corridors of power in London. For the British Admiralty, the loss of the Marie Claire and her companions was more than a maritime failure. It was a profound embarrassment and a diplomatic nightmare that required a policy of permanent erasure. The lost claim of the Crown refers to the deliberate decision by the British government to stop searching for the treasure, not because they didn't want the gold, but because admitting its existence would have reopened wounds the Empire was desperate to heal. The Ledger of Deniability. In the secret archives of the Admiralty, the disappearance of the silent convoy was filed under non-combat anomalies. British spies had known about the French gold. They had tracked the ships from the moment they left the French port, but they had lost them in the thermal nulls of the Chesapeake. When the storm of 1780 cleared and no trace of the ships was found, the British were faced with a dilemma. The prize money paradox. If the Admiralty officially declared the ships sunk, they would have to explain how 3 French frigates slipped through their world-class blockade. It was a stain on the Royal Navy's reputation for total sea mastery. The diplomatic debt. After the war ended and the United States was recognized as a sovereign nation, any claim to the gold by Britain would have triggered a legal battle over war reparations and international maritime law. The silence of the Crown. The decision was made to strike the silent convoy from all official prize logs. On paper, the Marie Claire had never reached American waters. By maintaining this Admiralty silence, the British ensured that no rival power, and certainly not the new American government, would know exactly where the treasure lay. The forensic erasure. Throughout the 19th century, several British survey expeditions were sent to the Virginia coast under the guise of mapping the Ghost Shoal for navigational safety. In reality, these were recovery missions. Using early diving bells and primitive sounding devices, they searched for the coral crypt. However, the Siren Cipher had done its work too well. The British were looking for wrecks, identifiable wooden hulls and masts. They were not prepared for the geological camouflage of the coral. To their eyes, the jagged limestone ridges were merely natural hazards, not the mummified remains of a fortune. By the late 1800s, the files were moved to the permanent dead room of the Admiralty. The gold was declared unrecoverable and null. The British government chose to treat the treasure as if it had never existed, preferring a clean ledger over an expensive, public, and potentially humiliating salvage operation. The modern null, a legacy of shadows. Today, the Siren Cipher remains one of the great silent myths of the Atlantic. While modern treasure hunters occasionally catch wind of the drowned gold of the Revolution, they are met with a wall of bureaucratic silence.
The documents within the coral crypt are the final hurdle. If recovered, they would prove that the French intervention was far more massive than history books record. They would reveal the secret financial ties that built the American Republic, ties that both the UK and the US have, for various geopolitical reasons, preferred to leave in the dark. The wealth is still there, encased in its limestone coffin, guarded by the sharks and the shifting sands. It has become a part of the geological silence of the Chesapeake. The gold that was meant to change the course of a war now serves as a foundation for a reef, a silent monument to a time when men used the stars and the moon to hide a fortune from the world. The lost claim remains unclaimed, not because the gold is gone, but because the cost of its truth is too high for any nation to pay. And so, Captain Blake's convoy continues its mission, maintaining its silence, guarded by the tide, the coral, and the permanent, dark pressure of the deep.
This long and detailed discussion of American history slowly comes to an end right here. We hope that this quiet narration has helped your mind find rest and has made your sleep even deeper and more comfortable. To listen to another dull yet important chapter from the pages of history on a future night, you may follow the channel. May every one of your nights be tranquil and restful. Good night.